August 15, 1944, Camp 30, Bowmanville, Ontario. Captain Hans Weber stood in formation outside Barrack 7, his gray prison uniform soaked with morning dew. The metallic clang of the gate opening cut through the silence. 20 names had been called. His was one of them. No explanation, no destination. Just orders to board 2 rattling civilian buses parked beyond the wire. Weber's boots crunched on gravel as he climbed aboard. Through the bus window, he watched Camp 30 disappear behind him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought formed that he couldn't quite silence. If Canada was the bombed-out wasteland Berlin had promised, why did everything outside look so painfully, impossibly alive? And in that moment, staring at green fields stretching to the horizon, he realized the war he thought he understood had never existed at all. Weber was 32 years old, a U-boat commander, a decorated officer who had sunk 12 Allied merchant ships in the North Atlantic. He had received his Ritterkreuz directly from Hitler's hands in 1942. Every fiber of his training, every word of his indoctrination, every particle of his certainty told him that Germany was winning this war. The propaganda machine had been flawless. German newspapers published photographs of starving American children. Radio broadcasts described Canadian cities reduced to rubble by Luftwaffe bombing raids. Newsreels showed staged Allied defeats, scripted surrenders, fabricated collapse. Weber believed it all. Why wouldn't he? His government would not lie about something so fundamental. These were facts delivered by trusted sources, confirmed by officers who outranked him. If you're watching this story unfold and finding value in keeping these histories alive, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching. From these tales of courage, deception, and awakening deserve to be remembered. Camp 30 held 612 German officers, not ordinary soldiers, elite warriors, U-boat aces who had terrorized the Atlantic, Afrika Korps veterans who had fought beside Rommel in the desert, Luftwaffe pilots who had flown missions over London. Every man held officer rank. Every man had sworn an oath to the Führer. Every man believed, with the certainty of religious faith, that Germany's victory was inevitable. The camp sat on 75 acres of Ontario farmland, surrounded by guard towers and double rows of barbed wire. Inside, the prisoners lived according to Geneva Convention standards. Each man received 2,800 calories per day. They had access to medical care, dental treatment, books, musical instruments, sports equipment. They could write letters home. They could take educational classes. They played volleyball in the yard and formed musical bands in the evening. Outside the wire, Canada was bleeding itself dry to defeat them. Every Canadian family operated under strict rationing. Gasoline was limited, sugar, butter, meat, coffee, all controlled by ration cards. Factories ran 24 hours, producing tanks, aircraft, ships, ammunition. The nation had mobilized every resource, every person, every ounce of industrial capacity toward one goal, destroying the Third Reich. Yet the German officers saw none of this. They saw well-fed guards and organized operations and assumed Canada was using its last reserves to maintain appearances. They noticed the absence of bomb damage and concluded that U-boats must still be blockading North American ports. When guards showed newspapers reporting Allied victories in France, the prisoners laughed it off as propaganda. Newsreels of D-Day were dismissed as Hollywood fabrications. Even Red Cross confirmations were met with indulgent smiles. Weber and the others trusted their government completely. It would never lie to them. The bus rattled south on Highway 2. Weber pressed his face to the window, memorizing every detail. Fear faded into confusion. The land was green and alive. Fields stretched wide. Cows grazed calmly. Farmers harvested wheat. Red barns, white houses, gardens, and laughing children appeared everywhere. They rolled through Bowmanville. Shops brimmed with goods. A grocery overflowed with food. Hardware gleamed with tools. People ate breakfast in restaurants. Cars filled the street despite supposed fuel shortages. Nothing matched the ruin Germany had promised. Weber felt a tightness in his chest. Where were the destroyed cities? The starving civilians? U-boats should have strangled trade. Bombers should have leveled towns. Another prisoner whispered about bomb damage. Weber saw none. Farms and towns passed endlessly. Trucks hauled equipment north. A freight train rolled by. A war bonds billboard smiled confidently. After 2 hours, taller buildings appeared. Then came a deep, constant rumble, heard even through closed windows. The sky was clear. The sound grew as signs pointed to Niagara Falls. German papers claimed it was ruined by pollution. Weber had believed that. Why would anyone lie about a waterfall? The thunder was water. The buses stopped near Table Rock. Prisoners filed out into blinding sun. Mist filled the air, cool and clean. The roar vibrated through Weber's chest. Guards led them along a paved path. With every step, sound and spray intensified. Horseshoe Falls burst into view, a vast curved wall of white water. It stretched impossibly wide and tall. Water poured endlessly, crashing into boiling depths. Mist rose like smoke. A rainbow burned through the spray. The noise erased thought, speech, denial. This was overwhelming reality. Weber stumbled to the railing, soaked and shaking. The power seemed impossible. No natural force could sustain this. There had to be machinery. He asked a guard about pumps. The young Canadian looked baffled. This was simply the Niagara River, flowing naturally. No machines, just nature. Weber refused to believe it. He declared it a film set. Others agreed, pointing at rainbows, rocks, and sound, inventing explanations. Guards watched in disbelief as officers searched for seams and speakers. For an hour the water thundered on, endless, unstoppable, undeniable. Weber stood at the railing as his certainty slowly cracked. Trained as an engineer, he understood machines, pumps, and limits. He calculated silently. Pumping that volume of water would require factory-sized engines and immense fuel. Hiding such machinery was impossible, and wasting wartime resources made no sense. He studied the base of the falls where water slammed into the river, sending waves rolling far downstream. No pump could sustain such force. Painted backdrops would shred instantly. The mist was real water. He could taste it. The illusion theory collapsed under basic physics and experience. The crack widened into a canyon. Weber gripped the railing, shaken. If this was real, his government had lied. If they lied about this, what else was false? He watched for 30 minutes as the water fell endlessly, powerfully, impossibly. Finally he whispered, "Mein Gott, es ist echt." Colonel Taylor observed from a distance, noting Weber's softened posture and broken certainty. Something fundamental had shifted. Taylor wrote in his journal, "The experiment was succeeding." Over 6 weeks, 8 more trips followed. By October 1944, 214 German officers had stood at that railing. Before the visits, re-education had failed completely. Newspapers, films, reports, and testimony were all dismissed as propaganda. After Niagara Falls, 139 prisoners began questioning what they'd been told, a 65% shift. Curiosity replaced contempt. Questions replaced rejection. A waterfall achieved what arguments never could. Letters home revealed the impact. Prisoners wrote of beauty, mist, rainbows, and lies they'd been told. Intelligence officers read confessions of doubt and awakening. If this place existed, what else was true? The falls forced questions propaganda could no longer suppress. Hardcore loyalists resisted fiercely. They dismissed the falls, invented new conspiracies, then used threats. Some doubters recanted publicly under pressure. Still, the crack spread. Stories traveled through camps. Prisoners requested transfers, hoping to see the falls. The waterfall became a symbol dividing belief from awakening. Weber changed completely. He read newspapers, asked questions, and abandoned speeches of superiority. He understood truth had physical weight. On May 7, 1945, surrender was announced. Most prisoners accepted it. Years later, letters thanked Canada, and many mentioned Niagara Falls the moment truth became undeniable. In summer 1945, the prisoners boarded ships and returned to Germany. Weber stood on deck as the ship approached Hamburg. The last time he'd seen his homeland was 1943, before his submarine was sunk and he was captured. Back then, Hamburg had been a functioning city despite bombing raids. Now, as the ship came closer, Weber saw mountains of rubble where buildings used to stand, entire neighborhoods burned to the ground, port facilities half destroyed, cranes twisted and broken against the sky. The ship docked, and Weber walked down the gangway onto German soil. The smell hit him immediately: smoke and dust and decay. Bodies were still being pulled from collapsed buildings 9 months after the war ended. No electricity in most areas, no running water in many districts. People lived in basements and makeshift shelters made from pieces of bombed buildings. Children with thin faces and hollow eyes begged for food on street corners. Weber had been prepared for this. The men who had visited Niagara Falls had spent months at Camp 30 learning to accept difficult truths. The waterfall had cracked open their certainty, and once that crack appeared, other truths could flow in. When Weber saw his destroyed homeland, he felt deep sadness. But he was not surprised. The wall of lies had already crumbled. He had already started learning how to face reality instead of hiding from it. He made his way to his family home in a suburb outside Hamburg. The house was still standing, though windows were blown out and the roof had holes from shrapnel. His wife and 2 daughters had survived by hiding in the cellar during final bombing raids. They had very little food. They wore clothes mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. His oldest daughter, who had been 12 when he left, was now 15 and looked like a tired adult. Weber tried to explain to his wife what he'd learned in Canada. He told her about the farms and towns he'd seen from bus windows. He told her about well-fed guards and organized camp operations and adequate food rations. He told her about standing at Niagara Falls and realizing that everything the Nazi government had told them was a lie. His wife listened quietly, then said, "I knew they were lying 2 years ago when the ration cards stopped being honored, but I could not say it out loud. They would have arrested me." In the years that followed, something remarkable happened across Germany. Former POWs who had been held in Canada began talking to their neighbors and family members about what they'd experienced. They described the contrast between what they'd been told and what they actually saw. They talked about Canadian cities that were not bombed. They talked about food supplies that were not running out. They talked about industrial capacity that was not collapsing. And they talked about Niagara Falls. But even more remarkable was what happened next. Starting in the early 1950s, former German prisoners began returning to Canada, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants. They brought their wives and children. They applied for citizenship. They started businesses and bought homes and became part of Canadian society. By 1960, more than 400 former POWs from various Canadian camps had made Canada their permanent home. Weber was one of them. In 1953, he arrived in Toronto with his family and opened a small bookstore on a quiet street in the east end of the city. He sold books in both German and English. He became a Canadian citizen in 1957. He lived in Toronto for 40 years, watching the city grow and change around him. He never forgot that he had once been an enemy of this country. He never forgot that Canada had shown him kindness when it didn't have to. In 1987, a reporter from the Toronto Star interviewed Weber for a story about former POWs who had stayed in Canada. Weber was 75 years old by then, with white hair and hands that shook slightly when he poured tea for the reporter. He spoke about his time at Camp 30, and the day guards took him to Niagara Falls. "I was certain the Allies were lying to us about everything," Weber said, his English still carrying a German accent after 34 years in Canada. Then they showed us Niagara Falls. I stood there at the railing trying to convince myself it was fake. I looked for the pumps. I looked for the painted backdrops. But I could not find them because they did not exist. The water was too real. The sound was too loud. The mist was too wet on my face. And I realized that if they had told me the truth about this magnificent waterfall, then perhaps they had told me the truth about other things too. That waterfall saved my mind. It broke through the propaganda and let reality in. Without that experience, I might have gone home still believing the lies. I might have taught those lies to my children. Instead, I learned to question everything and to trust what I can see and touch and experience for myself. After the war, military organizations from around the world studied Canada's POW program to understand why it worked so well. The numbers told a clear story. Canada had held more than 35,000 German prisoners during the war years. The escape attempt rate was less than 2%, one of the lowest in the world. The cooperation rate was remarkably high. Prisoners volunteered for work details on farms and construction projects. They participated in educational programs. Violence between guards and prisoners was extremely rare. Military historians concluded that Canada had discovered a simple but powerful truth. If you treat people like human beings who have been deceived instead of treating them like evil monsters who deserve punishment, they respond to that humanity. The Niagara Falls trips represented this philosophy perfectly. Show people the truth. Let them experience reality with their own senses. Trust that facts are more powerful than propaganda. The lesson remains urgent today. In a world where misinformation spreads faster than ever before, people still build walls of false belief. They still live in bubbles where everyone agrees with the same wrong ideas. They still reject evidence that challenges what they want to believe. The technology has changed, but human nature has not. The solution that worked in 1944 still works now. Direct experience cuts through lies in ways that arguments cannot. When people see truth with their own eyes, when they touch it and feel it and stand in the middle of it, denial becomes much harder. Reality has weight. Reality has presence. Reality has the unstoppable power of Niagara Falls. Sometimes humanity's greatest monuments do the work that words cannot. Sometimes a waterfall is not just a waterfall. Sometimes it is truth made visible, the sound of lies washing away, and the mist of new understanding settling on faces that had been turned toward darkness for too long. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against propaganda is not better arguments or cleverer messages, but simply showing people reality and trusting them to recognize it when they see it.